Hi, everyone. Today's topic is, can a services business benefit from using Scrum? Your thoughts, Angela?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So where do you want to start?
All right, so let's describe services. What are some types of services? When we say that, what do we mean?
There's all kinds of services out there, right? There are people who will wait on you at a restaurant to take your order. That could be considered services. In an IT community or information technology community, there's staff augmentation services. Oh, we just need a database administrator. Oh, we just need a tester, right? So staff augmentation, they're augmenting your staff. Then there's also organizations that provide their service to create work for someone else, right? Work for hire, we like to call that. Gaming companies, if an organization outsources building a video game, build us a website, company who outsources creating, a website or some other piece of software. So there's work for hire type services organizations, and then all kinds of things outside of information technology, such as construction businesses, landscape businesses. We could go on and on. But basically, if your product is a service, could you use Scrum?
Yes, you can, is what I'm hearing.
So you're giving the short answer. Well,
So
I would say yes, it depends. See?
You have to do the consultant answer of it depends. Off the top, are there any that jump to your head, that jump into your mind that would not benefit certain type of services where it doesn't make sense?
If it's a staffing firm, and by staff augmentation, I mean the way they make their money is on somebody else's billable time. So their goal is to place a person at a client to perform one skill. I'm going to place a database administrator at a client on a staff equivalency. So hopefully we want to bill that person out for a full year. And then the staff augmentation company makes margin. They make, a cut for placing that person. So in a services business that focuses on augmenting other people's staff, doesn't really make sense for them to try to use Scrum to run that organization, because at its core, Scrum is about a team of people delivering a singular objective together. So how does that work?
Yeah.
If you're a staffing firm and you say, well, Christian's going to be placed at this client for a year, Rand's going to be placed at this client for a year, that those pieces of work have nothing to do with each other, there's little benefit that organization has in changing the way work is done.
Is there any others that come to mind, or is that the first one?
Well, sometimes people will say to me, you can't really use Scrum to build a house or in construction. And then, of course, you've got all these people doing just that. And when you think about, at its core, Scrum is a cross-functional group of people, team of people, working on a singular objective. Well, that works great in a construction environment because you need a bunch of different skills. They need to work together, ideally, to get that building finished or to get that house finished or what have you, whatever the goal is.
So for the places where Scrum makes sense for services, is there anything they have to change? Or is there anything that jumps to mind that when using Scrum would be different than say, a company that builds an actual physical product?
Well, there's a lot that has to change. So at its core, one of the things that a company that does work for hire, that builds a website for another organization or that builds a game for another organization, a work for hire company, they have to change the way they contract with the client. Because if the client is trying to operate on a waterfall model, a project management model, system development lifecycle model, and then the work for hire organization is trying to complete the work using Scrum, those things contradict one another. And sometimes when I'm talking to work for hire organizations, they will say to me, well, we can really do work the way we want to and still use our old contract. And I point out that falls short, because if there's just this big bang date at the end, yes, they could do work the way they want to at the work for hire organization using Scrum, but where's the feedback loop?
Right.
Where are they getting that feedback if they're not involving the client? Where are they getting the daily plan with each other? And so if they don't want to alienate their client or scare their client away with the Scrummy words or the Agile words, they don't need to do that. The statement of work or the contract doesn't need to say sprint, doesn't need to say daily Scrum. It can say client agrees to review deliverables once every 2 weeks. Client agrees to check in with us 15 minutes or less daily. So I think some people get really weirded out by all the vocabulary. So yes, we do need to change the way we're approaching work, but we don't need to use all the Scrum and Agile vocabulary if the client's not open to it.
So what happens to the accountabilities, like a product owner? Where does that come from in a services organization? Like if you're work for hire, what happens there?
So ideally, our product owner, from a Scrum perspective, owns the scope, owns the timeline, owns the money. And certainly in a work for hire situation, the client is the product owner because they're paying the services organization. They own the money to get that deliverable because the product owner owns who, what, why. Here's what I need. Here's who it's for. Here's why I need it. The developers, and in this case, that's the company doing the work for hire. They're the developers. They're the people developing the product. They own the how. And so you want that product owner, you want the client to be that active participant, that daily feedback loop that we just talked about, and certainly, a regular sprint review. So client agrees to review deliverables every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, whatever, however long our sprint is. Now let's just say the client's like, huh? You want us to do what? Yeah, we don't have somebody available that much. Well, services organizations, I'm sure, would love to provide that additional service for an additional fee, of course. The challenge there is then now we're back to the agreement. We're back to the statement of work.
Yeah.
So what kind of latitude is that person we're calling product owner for the purposes of this conversation? What are they given? Are they given access to subject matter experts at the client? How much do they get to decide versus needing to get input from people at the client? So again, everything kind of goes back to our contract for how we're going to work with one another.
So that covers the accountabilities. What about events? Are there any events that jump to mind that you need to have nuances to if you're working in this way?
For sure, the retrospective. The other ones are perfectly fine. Sprint planning, regardless of what you call it. Daily Scrum, regardless of what you call it. Daily check-in. Sprint review, crucial for the client to be there because even in just Scrum, the review is open to anybody. Customers, users, subject matter experts, we're reviewing the product and the whole group is collaborating on what's coming next, at least according to our Scrum guide. But the retrospective is a closed door conversation for just the Scrum team, product owners, Scrum Master, developers. So let's just say the product owner's on the client side, let's just say. If it makes sense to have them included for, hey, how's this going? The way we're doing work with each other, does that work okay? And get their input, great. But let's say it's something amongst the developers, right? So just really specific to that work for hire organization. Might be kind of awkward to have the client there. So we may have to kind of scale or split the retrospective. Yes, have a shorter conversation with that product owner if they're from the client side involved, and then just talk kind of as the implementer, so to speak. Or if we provided the product owner to said client, then there's no issue.
I was teaching a class, and there's a few folks in that class that were service-based organization, and in particular at like sprint planning, they were getting hung up on you like, well, what do you commit? How do you do it? And I remember you talking about just our example of like duration. When we know we have to train a class, it's 2 days. It's 2 days of our time. So it really, any other pointers on that when it comes to service-based work like that and how sprint planning might work?
Yeah, the developers get to size the work, in a Scrum environment, but I always caution people, is there effort, risk, complexity, uncertainty in the work? Because if there is, then sizing in something like story points, t-shirt sizes, whatever, might work great to compare work to each other, right? Based on there's an element of uncertainty or there's an element of risk and so on. When it is time-bound, like you and I teaching a 2-day certified Scrum Master class, no amount of us arguing about story points or arguing about t-shirt sizes is going to change the fact that Christian's marked out of capacity for 2 days because he's teaching a CSM. Angela's marked out of capacity for 2 days because she's teaching a CSM. So if it's really time-bound, then it's a non-issue because it is time. But if it's not time-bound and we're doing work for hire, well, we're still back to some sort of development, product development, software development, if it's a website or if it's a piece of software, whatever. So a team can still size work and pull it into that sprint. The challenge is the sales cycle. And so I've talked to many a services organization that does work for hire, and they're on board. They are all in on everything we've just talked about from a Scrummy perspective. We could get so focused, we could get so much more done. Oh crap, our sales team. Our sales team estimated it in hours, or our sales team promised in hours, and the accounting team shows the client the billable hours. One of the hardest things that I've coached with sales teams and accounting functions at work for hire organizations is letting that go. I'm like, we have a time box. It's called a sprint, regardless of whether you put the word sprint in that SOW or you just said every 2 weeks. It's the time box. And so I remember specifically this one team of salespeople that was just complaining about hours. They were just going on and on about the client and arguing about billable hours. And I said, who's showing him the billable hours? They said, we are. I said, well, stop it.
Stop.
Well, stop it.
Just stop it.
I said, why don't you start selling in sprints? Because during the refinement activity, that's where we're talking, in this case with your client, about what is in scope. We just call that a product backlog. Out of refinement can come your statement of work where you've contracted with each other for X number of sprints. You can just put the date if you want. Behind the scenes, we know, what that means. But in there, you can build monetary penalties into the agreement. So if client adds 2 more weeks, here's the additional charge. Yep. If client stays within scope, see, I'm not even saying product backlog item, stories. Client stays within scope, here's the discount that we'll pass along. So I'm like, start billing in sprints. And one of the guys goes, we'd make more. Oh, bummer. Right? It's like the accounting becomes infinitely easier. You'd make more. Client would have flexibility. We'd all be happy. A lot of the stuff they were bitching about just goes away. And then their next objection, we don't like saying refinement. We want to charge for that time. Where you're calling it refinement, we would just call it, requirements gathering or discovery, but we want to charge for that time. I said, who said you can't charge for it? The story they were telling themselves about the Scrum framework just wasn't true. They were thinking that they could only charge once they started sprinting. I'm like, you can charge for it? They're like, well, we don't like the word refinement. Okay, what do you want to call it? Well, no, discovery's overused. So they finally came up with inception. We're going to call it our inception phase, and here's how much it costs. I'm like, whatever floats your boat.
As long as it's under 3 syllables or 3 syllables or less, it should be real.
Whatever works.
Yes.
So it's not that we're not doing absolutely everything in the framework. We are. It's kind of like putting the pill in the piece of cheese, to get the dog to take it. So it's just putting it in a little different wrapper. But now, as a work for hire organization, we're working in a different way. And all that ideally really matters to the client is the outcome. Outcome.
Had another question on sales, but before I do that, if you are finding value from our podcast, if you could do us a favor, please consider liking and subscribing. We've also put a little survey out there too to see if there's any other content that you would like us to do. So please think of that. That would be awesome. That would help us out. But I want to go back to sales because when it comes to sales, what other methods could a sales team use if it wasn't Scrum, if Scrum doesn't work for them?
A sales team or from a services organization could use Kanban for sure. With Kanban, we have no sprint, we have no time box. It's all about flowing work through an existing system or an existing process for the purpose of improving it. So they could certainly look at something like that if they were finding their traditional way of managing work not effective.
So Kanban is an option for them.
Kanban's an option. The other thing I was thinking of is some of the students you and I have had over the years who have nothing to do with IT or work for hire organizations, but they are in a services profession. Like the school teacher you had, and I believe she even appeared on this podcast.
She did.
We've had, some other folks get a lot of benefit out of using Scrum, and so one of the things I when I use her as an example, I point out, because people go, oh, well, where's your Scrum team? Are they the kids? I'm like, yeah, they are. So she may not be, a work for hire organization. She's definitely providing a service because it's education, but is she getting value out of a transparent, ordered list? Yes. Is she getting value out of time boxing? When you're dealing with kids, hell yes. Is she getting value out of having that cross-functional team of people do anything together? Yes. So the other thing that happens, depending on the type of services organization you are, if the time box is important, because like we already talked about in a sales organization, right? Kanban may be more applicable because you can't control when the phone's going to ring or, when somebody answers you. But then instead of seeing the framework as product development, I almost reduce it to management. Just the way we manage work.
Yep.
We manage work with an ordered list.
Yep. I say that all the time. Scrum is a work management framework, and it helps you focus on being more productive getting through your work. So what is the work?
Yeah.
So in a recap, what would you say are the points you would want us to take away from this, Angela?
So the short answer to can Scrum work in services organizations is yes, depending on the type of services organization. So work for hire organizations can realize more value delivered, lower costs, more revenues by leveraging the framework. And other types of services organizations, if they need the time box, can realize some productivity if they use elements of the framework as a way to manage work. If the organization can't benefit from a time box called a sprint, probably not a good choice at all. If there's a desire to put more through an existing system, maybe want to look at one of our teammates and what he's doing with Kanban.
Cool. Thanks so much.